Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Three Questions With. I'm delighted today to be joined by Kate Rippon, who is a senior corporate affairs director. You've worked for the likes of Burson, Three, EDF, Lloyds Banking. I'm sure you've got a huge amount of perspective to offer us today, but thank you for joining us.
Great. Thanks, James. Good to be here.
Pleasure. So look, we'll go straight in. That awful dinner party question or networking question where the person you're speaking to's eyes glaze over.
Yeah.
So what is it you actually do?
So I help leaders and organizations with reputation is the short answer. And then I tend to say that I help them show up and engage with the right audiences at the right time and in the right way. And for me, talking about how they show up is really important, because I really believe that corporate affairs shouldn't just be seen as communications or even just engagement. It should be about changing how an organization behaves and how it makes decisions to consider reputation. So I always try and educate a little bit, because I think that's really important.
Showing up point isn't one we've had on here, but it's so important whenever I'm talking to candidates. And one of the themes when people are looking for work in our world is I want an organization that values the function.
Yes.
And actually what they really mean is I want a leader who's willing to show up for those different audiences. You know, if you've got someone who's just hiding away, it's really difficult to do great comms.
Definitely. And I think it's sure lots of people have worked with leaders who don't necessarily get it, that actually it's not about broadcasting the result of a decision that's already been made elsewhere, but corporate affairs should have a seat at the table so that reputation is part of that decision-making process. And we've all seen where organisations say one thing, but actually they're doing another. Corporate affairs is about bridging that gap to really build that trust, which is really at the heart of reputation. So yeah, for me, it's much more than just comms.
Yeah, and that point is as well around, you know, you can have great corporate affairs practitioners in place and a brilliant team, but if what you're trying to get them to say doesn't align with the way you're behaving or the way you're operating, it doesn't really matter how good they are. There's nothing you can.
Yeah, definitely. And also, in my experience, I've worked in organisations where I can look across some of the things that the organisation's doing. To me, it's a huge reputational risk. For example, like some practices on health and safety, or if there's not the right governance. And actually, the perspective from a reputation point of view isn't something that the business has necessarily considered before. It's not that they discount it, it's just not been there. I think corporate affairs can help educate people internally in the organisation and also reflect the outside world into the organisation and how things might look or come across to people who aren't in that bubble.
Yeah, it's a bit off piste, but given you've worked both agency and in-house, are there different ways in which you'd kind of identify how people feel about the organisation going into one of those, you know, interviewing for a role on the agency side or a role on the in-house side? Are there red flags or things you'd pick up?
I think it's, for me, when I speak with agencies for an agency role, I'm always really keen to understand how do they see their relationship with clients, and to try and unpick that a bit, because everyone talks about wanting to be a partner to their clients, but actually does that mean that they stand up to them, or do they tell them things they don't want to hear? And they might do in some circumstances, but I think that's very telling, the kind of mentality that an agency might have towards its clients. And I think for in-house roles, it's about this. To me, I really look carefully at the structure and kind of where does corporate affairs or communications sit, who's it reporting into, what are the teams that make it up, where are the dotted lines, and just sort of really try and understand how that then shows up in how the function works across the organisation and how connected it can be across the organisation. Because for me, the more connected it is, the better. But that's not.
Yeah. And it's also about how you interview them, right? People forget an interview is, I'm also interviewing you as to whether you're the right organisation for me. And I think the kind of questions you ask, you know, challenging them on how you challenge clients. Because I know as a recruiter, you know, we're very lucky we work in partnership, genuine partnership with our clients, and we are and challenge them. But there is always an element of, are you going to take the money and run if we challenge you too hard?
Yeah.
And obviously in-house, it's actually more about if change is needed, what does that actually mean to you? Because lots of people will articulate something they think they want, but actually, what does that really mean? Like, drilling down below that, you get the signals in terms of the structural elements of a corporate affairs function. But then there's the sort of little things that people might say through a process. And that's the tricky thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it's a really personal thing, because some of the things that will be important for me and how I approach corporate affairs will be different for others. I think for me, it's my career, I've always been trying to integrate, and I've moved across disciplines, and I tried to bring disciplines together. And that's just because I find that more interesting personally, and I really enjoy the variety. So I think where there are structures, for example, where there's excuse me, there's a pool of expertise and people work across lots of different specialisms, I find that quite interesting. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But also, I like to meet as many of the senior team as possible and just get a sense of how they would look to interact with corporate affairs and what they would be expecting, because they're going to be the key people that I'd be working with day to day anyway.
Yeah, excellent. Looking back over your career then, is there a singular piece of advice or 2 or 3 bits of advice you'd give your more junior self?
Yeah, definitely. I've loved thinking about this over the last few days. It's been a real kind of run down memory lane. I think the big thing for me is that it's a myth that you are in complete control of your career. And it's a really hard lesson to learn for yourself. But I think pretty much everyone has to learn it in some way. So I wish I had known that at the beginning. And I guess where that leads me in terms of advice is that just do what interests you and be curious. And for me, that having that kind of mindset has helped me take a few risks, and some have paid off and some haven't. But for me, it's meant that I've done things that I found more interesting over the years. Like I said, so I started in public affairs and spent 6 years or so working purely in public affairs and government relations. But then, having been in-house and seen other parts of the corporate affairs function, I was like, oh, media relations sounds quite interesting, sitting next to the press office at Lloyd's and sort of just getting a curiosity about other stuff going on, and then finding roles that had a bit more of that. So I think it's that, really. And then I think the other part to it for me is that people value things about you that you might not focus on, but to be open to that. And that can take you in different directions. And so for example, like when I was working in one organization, having been there some time, I was asked to lead a team that was totally out of my specialism, sustainability. I'd never had any sustainability expertise up to that point, but I was given that team because actually I knew I could find my way around that organization. And the challenge for that team had been that they weren't connected to the heart of the business and the people who were making decisions, but I could help them do that. And so it was a real learning curve for me, working, leading this team of great experts, but I could help them in a way that I hadn't necessarily expected. So
that as well, that idea of, if you boil down, because you often see, right, the corporate affairs function is often the one that sits on the exec that gets stuff tagged onto it. And I think actually your point there is exactly why it does. It's because it's a function that when it's done well at its absolute best, it connects the business to to itself, and then to the outside world, right? It's that, I always think it's information flow, right? If you can get information flowing through the business, you can do all sorts of interesting things with it. And no one does that better than corporate affairs, I don't think.
Yeah, definitely. And when I was in that same organization, and the communications department had at that time had the traditional kind of media bit, your public affairs bit, the regulatory bit sat as well. And the team that I was asked to create was actually the corporate affairs bit, and specifically it was to join the dots. And that was because in practice I had made myself be that person just from the work that I've been doing, but it had helped show the need for it. And I think, corporate affairs can really do that. And I think integrate things, because actually we're bringing that outside perspective, and people are human. Like, people don't separate themselves into whether they're a public affairs audience or a media audience. They're just people. So I think that's really important. And on that point as well, I think one thing I sort of struggled with earlier in my career was, particularly because I started in consultancy, and it was quite a stuffy consultancy, brilliant in many ways, and I loved it, and so much of it stays with me. But it was pretty formal, and you would sort of trained to be quite formal as a consultant. And towards the end of my time there, I sort of struggled with, well, I don't actually really feel like me, and how do I actually just be be a bit warmer or be a bit more not that you weren't friendly, but just how to find that right balance. And I think learning to do that in a way that works for you over your career is really important.
Yeah, it's a really good point that's I think a couple of people have touched on throughout this series. It's I know I suffered at the start of my career but because I probably wasn't being true to who I was a lot of the time.
Mm,
If you bend too far in the direction of others, you kind of get to the end of it and you go, well, what am I doing
yeah,
here? Is this
yeah,
in, do I want to do this? And
exactly.
it's very easy at the start of your career to go, well, this is the way people do things. And obviously
Yes,
we now live in a world that's changed dramatically in the last 10, 15 years and is probably going to go through its biggest period of change
yeah,
ever owing to AI. I suppose seeing, the quicker people can embrace themselves
yeah.
and how they fit and how they can make things work, the better.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really fascinating shift that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I remember, I worked in agency relatively recently, and that sense of younger generations coming through and kind of what are their expectations for how they dress in a consultancy environment, how you behave in certain meetings. Like, it's just very different,
Yeah.
and changing really quickly. So I think how big corporates in particular adjust to that and adjust quite quickly is going to
Mhm.
be really interesting. But I think it comes back to treating people as individuals.
Yep.
And I think definitely some of the things that I've been most proud of at work have simply been because I felt able to be myself, and then I could form a
Yeah.
better relationship with whoever it might have been.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you for those. I think, will resonate with lots of people. On to the hardest question, as it turns out. If you weren't working in the world of corporate affairs, what would you be doing?
I love this question because I really surprised myself with this one. I thought, oh my God, I've no idea what I'm going to say. And then actually, when I thought about it, I was like, yeah, I do know really. So, working communications, I've always loved words and language
Sure.
and reading and always been reading. And when I had a Saturday job, and a holiday job in my teens, I worked in our local bookshop on the high street, and it was the best job ever.
Mm.
It was really fun. It was a great group of people working together, but I loved customers coming in with random requests, for titles, or asking for recommendations. So
Um,
I think I would probably be running a very unprofitable bookshop, probably with a cafe attached to it.
yeah.
Um, and probably with about 5 or 6 of my mates, basically, and we'd just sit there and drink coffee, maybe sell a few books. Um, and I think probably have, because my daughter at the moment is learning to read, and I can just see the joy it's bringing her, the whole world opening up. So I imagine there'd be some
Yeah.
like children's story time, and make it into a bit of a hub would be great.
I'm picturing some sort of hybrid shop somewhere between the one from Notting Hill and the one from You've Got Mail. That
Yes,
kind of
exactly
like
that. Perfect.
you've got Meg Ryan, there's somewhere in that Venn diagram that's the shop.
Perfect. Actually, I remember watching Notting Hill and thinking, this is exactly what it's like. You do get
Yeah.
very just random interactions with people, but
Man.
yeah, it's a fun place to be.
Wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to run a totally unprofitable business because
Yeah,
money was no object? It would just be like
it would.
the joy of it.
Probably for a short amount of time, and
Yeah, yeah. It's such
then
a
I probably think maybe I should be running this a bit better. But if it's
yeah.
fun, which I think,
Well, John Dale, one of our previous guests at Punch Pubs, was just talking about how tough it is for that space
yeah,
at the moment. It's the
yeah,
same for any independent
yeah.
shop, independent
Absolutely. And I
place.
mean, one of the things that I've seen and been a bit involved with relatively recently is kind of how to resurrect high streets and
Yeah,
bring more of that kind of vibe back. So,
yeah.
yeah, in a world of
It's got to be
Amazon,
experience.
and yeah,
Yeah.
let's run highly unprofitable bookshops that are fun to be in.
That's the way to do it. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your time today. I
Pleasure.
really appreciate it. And some great answers there. So thank you again.
Cool. Thanks, James.
Cheers, Kate.